N-E-D-Y. Jack's the nation's favorite guy. Everyone wants to back Jack. Jack is on the right track, 'cause he's got high hopes.
It's been a good campaign in many ways, even though we've had a little difficulty getting our opposition to want to discuss the issues.
Mr. Humphrey and I may differ on because I think we agree on many things. What I think we're trying to decide here, what the people of Wisconsin are attempting to decide, is which candidate can best lead the Democratic Party in the election of 1960.
Jack was victorious in Wisconsin. Then it was on to the primary in West Virginia. Another fight against Humphrey.
Well, I hope we're going to do well. I guess we'll know better by the time the votes are counted.
I cannot come to you with great wealth. I cannot come to you with a political machine, if that's what you want. I don't have either. But this is not something that should be handed around as if it were a gift or a plaything. It is the most responsible job in the world, the most difficult one. And whoever seeks it, and whoever gains it, whatever may be his name or his political party, must be prepared to give his life to it and to his nation.
I want to say, however, to you folks here, the senator...
There was a surprise in store for the Kennedys in West Virginia. Tests indicated an easy victory. However, Kennedy's Catholicism had been overlooked. The voters in this primarily Protestant state soon expressed their hostility. The politicians followed, and the press latched on with front-page stories.
I would like to say that all 340 pounds of Matt Reese is for this man here for the presidency.
Some of Jack's advisors, including his father, wanted to ignore the religious issue. Jack thought differently.
The question of a candidate's religion seems to be discussed more and more as the primaries go on, and it has been brought up here in West Virginia. I must say I don't agree with this. I think the United States Constitution settled this whole matter of religious freedom far better than we can today. It provided it in two ways. First, in Article 1, it provided for the separation of church and state. And secondly, Article 6, it provided that there shall be no religious test for office. I hold that view. I came to West Virginia of my own free choice. It happens to have probably the fewest of my co-religionists of any state in the United States. But I'm running for the presidency not on this question. I'm running because I think it's a most serious time in the life of this country.
The overriding issue of the campaign became religious tolerance. A West Virginian could demonstrate his tolerance only by voting for Kennedy. The issue drawn, the tough Kennedy team attacked Hubert as a puppet and tried to cut off the flow of his campaign money. Led by friends and relatives, the Kennedy organization numbered in the thousands.
And he's got that big debate tonight at 8:30.
Joe Kennedy asked his old friend Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. to help. FDR was a hero to West Virginian miners. Franklin Jr. told the voters that Jack, not Hubert, was in the tradition of FDR.
No money for television, no money for printing. I say, where are the buttons? We have no money. So I say, all right, we'll just knock off the whole day, cancel out the program, and we'll get on this telephone. I'll call my friends in Minnesota. We'll call them in New York. We'll call them in Washington. We've got to raise the money.
The investment and the strategy paid off. Humphrey had been swamped. By convention time, Kennedy was the obvious front-runner. But Adlai Stevenson and Lyndon Johnson were still in the way. An enthusiastic last-minute Stevenson rally at the convention failed. Only Lyndon Johnson remained to be beaten.
I'm a candidate for president and only a candidate for president. I have no idea that anyone will consider me for vice president because I think it would be very difficult for a man to hold both jobs.
But Lyndon wasn't really organized for the Kennedy Blitz, for what he came to label Jack Kennedy's political genius. The strategy, propelled by the zeal of Bobby Kennedy, proved invincible. Bobby wouldn't take no for an answer. He begged, threatened, cajoled, and charmed. He browbeat and intrigued. He was a man obsessed. His singleness of purpose brought a reputation for ruthlessness and enemies, among them Lyndon Johnson, who had no great love for the Kennedys. Bobby tried to keep Johnson off the ticket. He thought Johnson would harm Jack's chances. Jack's appraisal was different. Johnson, he decided, was of utmost importance to the ticket. Without him, it would be difficult to fight Nixon in the South. The liberals might object, but this was a risk he had to take.
After giving the matter careful consideration, I felt it as my duty to accept. It's with my knowledge and consent that I'll be nominated this evening.
There were those who said it required considerable pressure to make you determined to join Mr. Kennedy. Is that true?
No, that is not true. I'm very proud to be on the ticket with Senator Kennedy. I don't submit very easily to pressures, and I've had no pressures in this connection.
We Republicans know, as I know, and as you know, that a new star has been born in the leadership skies of the nation here in Los Angeles. I know when I see political genius, and I have seen it in my friend John F. Kennedy. The Democrats of this nation are going all the way with JFK.
We know it will not be easy to campaign against a man who has spoken and voted on every side of every issue. Mr. Nixon may feel that it's his turn now, after the New Deal and the Fair Deal. But before he deals, someone's going to cut the cards. That someone may be the millions of Americans who voted for President Eisenhower, but would balk at electing his successor.
We've traveled within and outside of the United States over 500,000 miles, mostly by air, but a great deal by automobile, some by even ox cart, by boat, and virtually every type of transportation. There have been over 3,000 speeches made in campaigns and all over the world. As far as number of countries, we now have visited, since becoming, holding the present office, 55 countries all over the world. We met a lot of interesting people, some very, very important people. In fact, in running down the types of people we met, we found 35 presidents and 15 prime ministers, 2 emperors, 6 kings, of course a number of queens, 3 or 4 sultans, and so on, up and down the line.
We should rebuild our military strength, not because we want to declare war, but because we want to declare peace. If there is any lesson of the summit, it is that the communists believe that the military balance of power is shifting in their direction. Why was it necessary for a presidential candidate in Brazil, in the middle of his campaign, to pay a visit to Castro? Why was the United States unable to get an indictment of Castro by name at the last meeting of the Organization of American States? Because the power and prestige of the United States relative to that of the communist world has diminished in the last decade. Because these people wonder whether the future belongs to the Castros and the Khrushchev and the neutralists who are turning to hostility. They wonder whether the future belongs to freedom. Now that is the great issue of 1960. Can you imagine if this country elects a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate and elects Dick Nixon, Republican President of the United States, and then Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn go over to meet with him as the leader of the Congress and sit down with Dick Nixon, who in 1952 said Adlai Stevenson had a degree from the Cowardly College of Containment, in 1954 called Truman a traitor, in 1960 called me a liar, in 1960 called Lyndon an ignoramus. Lyndon says he called me one. No, I say he called Lyndon one. He called me rash, imprudent, reckless, naive, and uninformed, but he called Lyndon an ignoramus. You think he's going to go down and work with him? I don't care how many rescue squads they send to help Dick Nixon travel around the United States. I don't care if Cabot Lodge and Nelson Rockefeller and Barry Goldwater all prop him up and push him forward, and I don't care if they add Dewey, Landon, and Hoover to advise them how to win.
The people of the United States in this last week have finally caught up with the promises that have been made by our opponents. They realize that it's a modern medicine man show, a Pied Piper from Boston, and they're not going to go down that road.
For the presidency of the United States because it is the center of action. I run against a candidate who reminds me of the symbol of his party, the circus elephant, his head full of ivory, a long memory and no vision, and you have seen elephants being led around the circus ring. They grab the tail of the elephant in front of them. All right in 1952 and 1956, but there's no tail to grab this year. It's Mr. Nixon himself, and I don't believe he will secure an endorsement of the majority of citizens of this country at the time of change.
Jack Kennedy was elected President of the United States in 1960. The victory margin was slim, less than 120,000 of 68 million votes cast. Johnson had been an inspired choice. Mayor Dealey and his political machine a blessing. Minorities had been instrumental in the victory, but it was going to prove difficult to meet their expectations. In the realm of foreign policy, Jack Kennedy spoke boldly.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Under Kennedy, government became a family affair. Brother Bobby was appointed Attorney General, and that caused eyebrow lifting. But then Teddy, just turned 30, announced himself a candidate for Jack's Senate seat. The older brothers were embarrassed, but their father backed Teddy's decision.
I spent a solid
And then there was Sergeant Shriver, a son-in-law.
First time in 2 years when the phone rang, it was the president on there, and he called a couple of times, and finally my wife said, "Sarge, you've got to talk to Jack now. Remember, he's the president." And so I said, "Well, all right, I will." So about the third time I got on the phone, he said, "Listen, you've got to come down here to Washington to run the Peace Corps." I said, "Well, Mr. President, you know, I don't know anything about any Peace Corps." And he said, "Well, that's all right, neither does anybody else." And I said, but remember all the political debts you incurred during the campaign. Why don't you give this job to one of your political friends?" He said, "Listen, Sarge, the truth of the matter is that everybody thinks the Peace Corps is going to be one of the greatest fiascos in history. If it turns out that way, it's much easier to fire a relative than a political friend."
First, I want you to meet the lady who started it all. I feel that parents should be responsible for their children, so we really can blame our first guest for the way hers have turned out. Now, I introduce to you the head of the most successful employment agency in America, Mr. Joseph. The story of a typical American family from Hyannisport, a small town in Massachusetts. And the next seems like carrying coals to Newcastle because she is our secret weapon, our universal ambassadress, whom the people of France affectionately call Madame la Présidente, Jacqueline Kennedy.
The credit Rose Kennedy was accepting belonged in large part to her husband, who no longer attended public functions. At 71, his son in the White House almost a year, Joe Kennedy suffered a crippling stroke. His capacity to speak had been impaired, but he could still think clearly. He spent his time keeping track of his successful sons, even helped Teddy when he ran in '62. Fidel Castro and Cuba had been a campaign issue for Kennedy, what he called incredible Republican blunder, inaction, and failure in foreign policy. Kennedy would deal swiftly and firmly with the likes of Castro. Within months, Kennedy's campaign rhetoric was put to the test. The anti-Castro invasion of the Bay of Pigs had been planned under Eisenhower. Kennedy reviewed it, had his doubts, but approved the plan nonetheless. The American-backed Cubans didn't have a chance. They were flattened on the beach, forced into ignoble surrender. It was a monumental fiasco from start to finish. It made Kennedy seem rash, naive, imprudent, and uninformed, and in his area of self-proclaimed expertise in foreign policy.
I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them.
Within months, Kennedy kept an appointment in Vienna with the head of the Russian state. Some had suggested the summit conference be postponed to allow the Bay of Pigs to recede into history. Kennedy elected to go. The meeting in Vienna, planned to ease East-West tensions, achieved the very opposite. The city of Berlin, divided between East Germany backed by Russia and West Germany backed by the United States, was a sensitive spot. At the meeting, Khrushchev proposed an immediate treaty affecting Berlin and threatened to sign unilaterally if Kennedy did not agree on his terms. Kennedy was firm in his answer. Berlin would not be abandoned, and he would not accept an ultimatum. Khrushchev said that the Soviet Union's decision was irrevocable. He would sign in December. Kennedy answered, "It will be a cold winter."
I will tell you now that it was a very sober 2 days. There was no discourtesy, no loss of tempers, no threats or ultimatums by either side. No advantage or concession was either gained or given. No major decision was either planned or taken.
No spectacular progress was either achieved or pretended.
The East Germans built a wall in Berlin. The decision had been made to end the mass escapes across the border to the west. Kennedy mobilized the reserves and brought troops down the Autobahn from West Germany into Berlin. Americans were told, frankly, that atomic war was possible.
A dictator has a position that the leader of a free society does not have, and he can continue to push. If he miscalculates, and that's the great danger in all of these matters when dealing with a dictator, if he miscalculates, the world could be destroyed. I would hope that within the last few weeks he's come to the realization that the president and the free world are willing to use nuclear weapons to preserve our position in Berlin, to ensure that the people of Berlin remain free and that we have access to that city.
Some Americans took their government's advice and built fallout shelters. After months of negotiation and jockeying by both leaders, Khrushchev announced that since the Western powers were showing understanding and trying to solve the German problem, he would not insist on a treaty signature before December. The world breathed a sigh of relief. But the contest between the great powers was not over. The Russians, striving to extend their influence and increase their nuclear capabilities, took a drastic step. There was still fear in Cuba of an American invasion. Russia was Cuba's ally. Khrushchev, known for his willingness to gamble, sent missiles with nuclear warheads. Rumor of their existence in Cuba had been circulating in Washington for weeks. Conclusive proof reached Kennedy during the congressional election campaign. From the beginning, Kennedy said he must respond to the Russians. One had to act. But what were the options? He convened a special group of high-level military and civilians called the XCOM. Gathered at the White House, they asked themselves what really had changed. In an atomic war, a missile launched from Moscow is as deadly as one launched from Havana. Maybe nothing had changed, and therefore nothing should be done. Military advisors said bomb out the Cuban missiles. Congressional leaders were talking military action. McNamara proposed a blockade of Cuba to prevent delivery of any more Russian arms, a gesture intended to give the U.S. time to make its position clear and to give Khrushchev time to reconsider what he was doing. Bobby Kennedy supported the blockade strategy. He opposed an airstrike, saying Sunday morning sneak attacks were not part of the American tradition. He led the way towards more moderate action. The blockade was ordered, and Khrushchev told that the missiles in Cuba must be removed. The hours crept by. The world poised on the edge of atomic holocaust. Then 2 letters came from Khrushchev, each offering to remove the missiles if the United States met certain conditions. The offer of Khrushchev's first letter was accepted. The United States would formally and publicly agree not to invade Cuba. But as for the demand in Khrushchev's second letter, for the removal of U.S. missiles in Turkey, Bobby explained that President Kennedy had been anxious to remove these missiles for a long period, but there would be no public commitment to remove them. Khrushchev accepted. The Russian ships turned around in mid-Atlantic. The missiles were withdrawn, the bases dismantled. The United States, led by its president, had been firm, forbearing, and prudent. Domestically, Kennedy was faced with many problems, but none so difficult of solution as civil rights. It had been 100 years since black people had been emancipated, but they were not full-fledged citizens. Kennedy moved on many fronts. He named blacks to government posts. He had to use troops, finally, to get James Meredith into the University of Mississippi. and he had to find a way to keep the peace in Birmingham, a peace disturbed in great part by Bull Connor's police dogs and fire hoses.
Instructed Secretary of Defense McNamara to alert units of the armed forces trained in riot control and to dispatch selected units to military bases in the vicinity of Birmingham. Finally, I have directed that the necessary preliminary steps to calling the Alabama National Guard into federal service be taken now, so that units of the Guard will be promptly available should their services be required.
And as violence raged, men like James Baldwin could not contain their anger.
6 kids were murdered in Birmingham on a Sunday and in Sunday school in a Christian nation, and nobody cares.
Legislation, late in coming, was being pushed, but Martin Luther King and other blacks were not satisfied.
They go talking about these little levels of progress that we see here and there, and they say, you know, you've made great progress. Aren't you satisfied? No, we are not satisfied. We will not be satisfied as long as Negro boys and Negro girls are forced to live life without dignity and without respect. We will not be satisfied.
There was no easy solution, as America was yet to see. The first term was half over. Anxious to strengthen America's image abroad, Kennedy went to Berlin. He was pushing for accommodation with Khrushchev and an end to atomic testing.
2,000 years ago, the proudest boast was Civis Romanus Sum. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is Ich bin ein Berliner.
It was time to get moving on the 1964 campaign. Toward the end of November, he went to Texas. On November 22nd, 1963, he spoke in Fort Worth.
And as a result of the effort which this country has made in the last 3 years, we are second to none. In the past 3 years, we have increased the defense budget of the United States by over 20%, increased the program of acquisition for Polaris submarines from 24 to 41, increased our Minuteman missile purchase program by more than 75%, doubled the number of strategic bombers and missiles on alert, doubled the number of nuclear weapons available in the strategic alert forces, increased the tactical nuclear forces deployed in Western Europe by over 60%, added 5 combat-ready divisions to the armies of the United States, and 5 tactical fighter wings to the Air Force of the United States, increased our strategic airlift capability by 75%, and increased our special counterinsurgency forces, which are engaged now in South Vietnam, by 600%. I hope those who want a strong America and place it on some signs will also place those figures next to it.
Within hours, he was in a motorcade in Dallas. The crowds were mostly friendly.
anybody's been hit, but apparently something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong. At this point, it looks as though it could have been one or two or even all of the people within the car may have been the victims, may have been struck by shots. We don't know.
He was coming down the street, and my 5-year-old boy and myself were by ourselves on the grass there on Palmer Street, and I asked Joe to wave to him, and Joe waved, and I waved, and the man... That's all right, sir. You waved, Charlie. As he was waving back, the shot rang out, and he slumped down in the seat.
It fell to Ted Kennedy to break the tragic news to his father. A nurse who saw Joe Kennedy after his son left him found him with tears in his eyes, tightly gripping the covers of his bed. Jack Kennedy had been president 1,065 days. Eventful, critical, dramatic days. The survival of the world at stake, and he at the center of it all. Young, handsome, regal, full of life, vigor, brilliance, and wit. And now he was gone. So much promised, so much unfulfilled. Throughout the world he was mourned, and it seemed his untimely end was more than the wanton murder of a man, more than the senseless slaughter of a president. It seemed as if hope itself had been assassinated in Dallas.
It is my privilege and honor to introduce the man who stood closer to him in times of crisis and in times of fun than anyone else, his brother, Robert Kennedy.